Hello and welcome to the show. Thanks for tuning in to You Have a Cool Job, episode number 39. From Peterson's, I'm Jaclyn Walsh, and you're listening to a podcast highlighting those who took their profession in a unique direction and what they did to get there. On this week's episode of You Have a Cool Job, we're talking with author and comic book creator Dave Dellecese. Dave received a bachelor's degree in broadcasting and mass media communications and a master's degree in information and design technology. Before discussing his comic book series Holidaze, I asked Dave to share about how his career began as a journalist before transitioning to his current role as director of content strategy for a private college.
Originally, I had been going to school, before I started going to school for broadcasting and communications, I had originally started out going for screenwriting, with, all the intention that I was going to be a screenwriter. And in my younger days, that now seems like a lifetime ago, was really focused on writing and telling stories in a script type of format and, creating, luckily it was at the time of kind of like the digital boom. Creating, independent films using digital technology. But in time, those kind of skills transitioned into a more journalistic interest, and I became interested in putting that craft to use as a journalist. And I worked for a while as a newspaper journalist in print, and then I made the switch from print to broadcasting television, where I worked as a TV reporter, TV news anchor, assignment editor, video editor, pretty much anything that was called upon in a newsroom. And I did that for probably the bulk of my adult life career as a journalist. And then I transitioned out. We had our first child while I was working in news, and after about a year, after about his first year, I kind of thought to myself that, like, boy, I really don't want to go the rest of my life for these crazy journalist hours, and decided that I wanted to try and put all of those skills of writing and communications and journalism towards something that might be a little different, and also might provide a little more stable work hours with a family growing at home. And so I started. I took a job after news in public relations at a state university, and I did that for several years. And when my current position opened up at a private college, and it seemed like the perfect blend. It took the aspects of my journalism career, which was interviewing and telling stories and managing assignments and who was doing what, and that kind of news editor role, with everything I had learned about higher education, working at the state university doing PR. So kind of married those two things together into the role that I'm in now, which is the perfect blend, and I enjoy very much. It's kind of the best of both worlds for me.
Dave's comic book series Holidaze centers around the bar mythical holiday characters visit after work. Wondering how he manages to work full-time and continue his career as an author, I asked Dave to share about his professional journey as a writer.
I never stopped telling the creative stories. Harking back, I mentioned in the very beginning about going to school for screenwriting because I really wanted to tell stories, and they were always in that film and script format. And then I got into journalism, which was, obviously very much about telling real life stories and real people. But even though I headed down that path and then eventually into PR and content creation, I never stayed out of touch with the creative passions, I guess you would say. I hate to use that word because I feel like sometimes that gets overused quite a lot. And so I've, in the past however many years, continued to write and work on my craft there. worked with a talented artist named Andrew Slitsky, and we had created two comic book, a comic book series digitally called Holidaze, which was a more adult-oriented comic book series that people could go online and purchase digitally and read. And it was all about the bar where all the holiday characters, or mythical characters like Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy, the Easter Bunny, all go after work to drink and hang out and usually get into a bunch of trouble together. And so we had done that series together, and then we have a graphic novel coming out that we tested the waters on in recent years called Lacey and Lily, about it's an all-ages book about a middle school girl and her dog who find a pair of suits that when they put them on give them superpowers. They naturally become superheroes. And that's coming out sometime in the next year, but I can't say too much more about that because there's contractual things there with the publisher. So I'll wait for them to make the official announcement about that.
I heard Dave mention the term graphic novel, so I asked him to explain the difference between a comic book and a graphic novel.
I don't think there's much. I think some people get a little too kind of hoity-toity about that kind of terminology, but I look at it really as though a comic book is sort of that floppy type of book that you'd buy on the newsstands that, is probably about 20 pages or 40 pages or so. And maybe it's a series, so it comes out on a regular basis. Whereas a graphic novel, it's kind of presented more like a book. You would find it as a thick paperback type of book with maybe 140, 150 to several hundred pages, and it tells a complete story. Whereas a comic book could be a short story, or over the course of several issues be part one of a 12-part story. Whereas a graphic novel is sort of a complete tale told all in one and presented sort of in that book-like format.
As a newcomer to the world of comics, I wondered which came first, the text or the illustrations. Dave explains the process he uses when developing a story with his collaborator.
You can do it one of two ways, and it, actually I think probably more than just two ways. And different teams, I think, do it different ways. Andrew and I have tried it different ways over the years. We've tried it where I've kind of given just a rough outline, a couple paragraphs of what happens in a story, and let him go nuts and draw, and then I go back and I write all the dialogue for it to be put back in. Personally, he prefers what he calls a tight script, which is where I write out specifically what happens. So page 1, panel 1. Santa walks up to the bar. Panel 2, or page 1, panel 2. The Easter Bunny walks up to the bar as well, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There are a lot of different ways you can do it. Some people who are both author and illustrators, they tend to do it either way too. They may write it first and then draw it, or they may draw as they go with the story in their head. There's a lot of well-known comic creators teams throughout the decades who have done it different ways. Sometimes they just write out a plot and then give it to the artist to kind of hash out the story, and then they give it back to the writer, and the writer comes up with all the dialogue. So it can really be any way. I think it depends on what works for that particular team of people and how their preferences and personalities mesh.
With today's technology assisting writers in terms of distributing their work, I asked Dave to describe the process he uses for getting his work published.
Well, in today's age, there's a lot of different ways that can happen. There's still the traditional route where you can go and shop things around to agents, literary agents, or publishers that are seeking submissions, whether it's a novel or a kid's book or a comic book, etc. But that's still very much the traditional method, and that still exists. There's also, more so than ever, we live in this era where it's never been easier to publish books yourself. There are a myriad of companies and distributors that have sort of opened up their doors to allow authors the ability to publish through them. So even though these are companies that usually distribute books to bookstores or online retailers, they're now offering options for publishing, usually on demand, which means that once the novel or the comic or the book or whatever it is approved by the company, it's usually, I guess, just kind of stored until somebody orders a copy, and then a copy is created and then sent out to those people. So it cuts back on both the distributor and the author from the risks of having warehouses full of books that possibly don't sell. So that's certainly an option these days. And then sometimes it's a blend of both. Sometimes some folks are self-publishing and they grab the attention of a larger publisher who wants to pick up a book or a future book from that person or team, and it goes from there. So you can sort of they get discovered. So there's a lot of different ways that it can work, and I would say that we certainly live in an era where there's just multiple ways to kind of make those stories a reality.
We'll get back to Dave's story right after this.
Are you searching for the right college, grad school, or trade school to fit your needs? Or are you studying for those entrance exams you need a good score on? Peterson's has you covered. With advanced college and scholarship search functions, test prep for everything from the SAT to the MCAT to the firefighter exams, and tons of free resources on our blog, Peterson's helps you find, get in, and pay for school, plus much more. Visit petersons.com today.
Welcome back to You Have a Cool Job with author and comic creator Dave Dellecese. Dave's an avid reader and comic book fan, so I asked him what his favorite comic book is.
Oh gosh, it's tough because I don't. I read so few like modern comic books these days. I'm a big fan of old comics like the '60s and the '40s. In fact, I wrote my master's thesis on how comic books during World War II were actually used as a form of American propaganda to build support for the war, and the role that the government sometimes played in some of those stories that were out there. So I have a real kind of soft spot and love of comics from those older eras, the 40s to the 60s. But so I don't read as much these days. But there is a smaller comic book company called Ahoy Comics, and they have a comic called it's called The Wrong Earth, and it's just this brilliant concept that I love, and it's very funny. The concept is basically, and I'll use a well-known character instead of theirs for a second. What if the 1960s Batman and the modern-day Ben Affleck Batman switched realities, and the Ben Affleck type Batman lived in that 1960s Batman world, and the 1960s Batman lived in the dark, gritty, real world. Only they do it with their characters, which is like Dragonfly Man and Dragonfly, and it's just this really great concept because it takes all of the themes and all of the auras of the comics, of the wackiness of the comics of the 60s and those characters and the true do-gooder fashion, and contrasts it up against the real world, and then vice versa, taking that really dark toned character of today's comic industry and planning it in the kind of the wacky 60s era.
With a family and a full-time job to focus on, Dave explains how his writing routine has changed since acquiring such a busy schedule.
Yeah, now it's sort of a window. I have a few moments. While it's hard to find energy to solely focus, I'd like to think that even in the background that your mind is always working, and sometimes it may be something that hits you while you're, laying in bed at 3 a.m, and you wake up with this thought of oh my gosh, that's what's been eluding me. That's the part of this concept that I haven't been able to figure out, or it could be when you're sitting, in a meeting and you're talking to people about something completely unrelated, and then all of a sudden your mind has had that time to step away from the other stuff and it hits you. Those things I think are pretty common. I think that one thing though that I hear a lot of and I agree with is that you've got to try and write as much as you can, even when you're not feeling like it, because if anything, you might get the bad stuff out. Not everything's going to be great that you put to paper, but if you continue to write, it's kind of like the law of odds, right? Like if you write enough, sooner or later something in there's got to be good. So you're sort of kind of filtering out, getting all of anything out, no matter what it is, even all those bad ideas or bad sentences. And if you keep at it, you'll start to find the stuff that you like and the good stuff that's worth holding on to. And then when in your editing process, you can obviously make the call of what's good and what's bad later.
As we discussed, Dave's portfolio includes screenplays, a novel, a children's book, and a comic book series. I asked Dave to share which element of his work gives him the most personal satisfaction.
It was probably so far. It's probably been the children's book that I did, The Little Lamp. It was a very personal story, personal product. It was something that I spent quite a few years working on until it was just right, and until I had the absolute right illustrator to go along with it after it was written. And it was something that just meant a lot to me to be able to tell a story of such hope and positivity, and to have the potential. And I say that because I didn't know at the time, but now I'm just so grateful that it has resonated with people as much as it has, that it's meant so much to people. And to hear stuff like that is wonderful, and it's that personally is where a lot of my future focus lies. I would love to do more children's books and more novels. I did a novel a couple of years ago. At the time, I did because I wanted to do it. If I'm speaking candidly, it sort of was. I look back on it as sort of something that I needed to get out of my system, because when I go back and I read it now, I realize it's more like it was written almost like a Dave of like 15 years ago, maybe even more, versus the kind of stuff that I would write today. That novel, original novel, is very grim and sort of hopeless, and that's just not who I am now. That might have been who I was at times when some of those concepts were written in my 20s. But not today. Today, in this stage of life that I'm in, I'm really interested in telling stories that lift people up, that have shines of hope and brightness for the world. And I think that there needs to be more of that, and that's really where a lot of my focus has gone. And I'm willing to admit that not everything that I have written in my portfolio is going to be stellar, but that I'm going to feel the same way about it at the time it came out. I use that novel as an example all the time. I have another novel I've been working on, a historical fiction novel, but I had hoped it might come out this year, but maybe it'll come out next year, that really follows that pattern. It's more about people and hope, and the hope that we find in ourselves. And The Little Lamp was the same way. The comic stuff is a lot of fun, but even something like Holidaze changed, evolved over time. I know I'm sipping all over the place, but if I'm being candid and introspective here, Holidaze started out sort of as a one-story deal. We had done it just as this kind of fun one-off, like, oh, wouldn't it be great to do like a Christmas special for grown-ups? All these characters hang out in the bar, and they're always like, they're drinking and getting into trouble, and it was sort of like a one concept sort of thing to do this offbeat, the original concept was this offbeat Christmas special, and you go back and if you look at the first 1 to 3 original stories we did for Holidaze, they're a bit more not raunchy, but they're more risque, and it evolved after that into a more kind of silly, goofy, sitcom-y, primetime sitcom series, and I'm much more comfortable with that than where it started out. And it's the sort of thing where I'm totally willing to admit that I felt like we missed the mark in the beginning, and it took us time to find our footing. If I were to go back and read the first story of Holidaze, I might go okay, that's all right, that's okay, but it wasn't anything that felt sustainable. Whereas when you make it, it was about holiday characters acting badly. Oh, they're at the bar and they're drinking and they're and they're carousing and all these things. But okay, it's a funny joke, but it's not sustainable. You can't continue to tell great stories about that. But a few stories or issues in, when we started looking at it as though what if this was like Cheers? What if this was okay, a bunch of folks, who their day jobs are the holiday characters, but now they hang out at the bar. And yeah, they drink and they get into trouble, but it's a more sitcom-y kind of trouble. And then the comedy came better, the concepts came better. And to me, the series just became something that I was much happier with than when we started out. So whether it's that, looking back on that first novel that I did, I make no allusion to the fact that not everything I do is great, and I don't expect it to be looked at that way. And I can certainly look back and see the flaws in things, but it helps any writer, I think, when you can look back and say, oh boy, that was pretty crappy. Why did I do that? To kind of take from that and use it as you go forward to make things more akin to what you want them to be, what you want to put out there in the world. Yeah.
Breaking into the comic book industry can be challenging for newcomers. Dave shares his advice for aspiring comic creators and authors.
Stay at it. Keep at it. Don't feel that just because something doesn't click or doesn't take off that you've failed. Take it, learn from it, keep going. If you feel excited about something, stay with it. It does not matter if, Simon & Schuster, doesn't pick up your novel. It doesn't matter if, DC and Marvel don't like your comic book concept. If you're excited about it, you still see the potential in it, stay with it and stay at it, because that's only going to get better in time. And if it makes you happy and it fulfills you, that's what's the most important goal. And I think that sometimes people give up too easily if they, do something and it doesn't take off. There's a knee-jerk reaction, or sometimes it's easy to let that darkness slip into their mind and say, well, that's it, I'm not going to do this anymore. But if you were excited about it, hold on to that spark of excitement and just kind of put it in a bottle and let it keep shining to push you forward. Because in the end, it's what you create, not necessarily who it was created or what. How large a splash it makes.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. We hope you're inspired by Dave's story to continue following your passions too. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week.